Hello, good evening, sir. Praveen, sir.
Good evening, ma'am. Yeah,
Good evening, sir.
good evening.
So, good evening, sir. So, a
Should I?
very good. I'll 1 minute, sir.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
sure.
very good evening to all of you. So, I welcome to all the participants. So, today is the fourth day of faculty development program. So, our resource person will deliver the talk on SVM, regression, clustering, and ensemble methods. And dear participants, attendance is mandatory. Attendance is mandatory for all the days. You will be required to be present for the end of the session. 80%, you must maintain the 80% attendance for all the days. Why? Because education is the passport to the future. For tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. So don't miss the class and maintain the attendance. So, Abindayal sir, please start the session.
Sure. Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the day 4 on the FDP program, Foundations of Machine Learning and Deep Learning. So, in the last class, we discussed about two new algorithms, which was naive Bayes and decision trees. I hope you were able to go through those algorithms, lectures, and also the code. So today we'll move forward and we will talk about one other very powerful algorithm called as SVM. And then we will focus a little bit from classification and shift towards regression and also unsupervised learning methods clustering. So let's get started. So as usual, this is the classification setting we are in right now. So today we will first initially for the first few minutes, we'll discuss about classification and then we'll shift to regression. So as you know, classification, the strategy is to basically draw a classifier or a boundary that can separate the two classes over here or that can separate the three classes over here. So now that you have a good idea about what are these decision boundaries and everything, so let me pose a simple question to you. So let's say I have these three different decision boundaries with me. All of them are able to classify these two classes correctly. But which one would you pick? Like, or which one does your intuition say is the correct one that I should pick? All of them will give the same accuracy during training time, but which one would you go for in the final? One classifier number one, classifier number two, or classifier number three? Any guesses? You can
Please,
unmute and sorry.
3.
Okay, any other guesses? Okay, so three is yeah, two is the correct answer. I'm sorry who said it, but yeah, two is the correct answer because when you look at the classifier two, the two is in such a way positioned that it is farthest away from both the classes. So what we want over here is a classifier that can give us some buffer. What is this buffer? You can see this dotted lines, right? So this is the buffer, or we call it as margin. Why do we even need to have this margin? Because if you remember, this is the sample which we are seeing while training or even when we do test. But like I said, in real world, there is a lot more data which we'll never see during the training or testing time. So we always need to accommodate for this margin of error. And what is that margin of error? This basically this entire width you can see. If you consider 3, the margin of error is not at all there because it's very close to this blue class and it is very close to this purple class. So it's better to pick a classifier where you have this margin of error possibility. So this is the entire idea about support vector machines to maximize this margin. What should be my classifier that will maximize this margin and give me that particular classifier as the output? So I've written over here hyperplane. Hyperplane is nothing but another word for a linear class, a classifier. So planes and hyperplanes are in more than 3 dimensions. Those are hyperplanes. Okay, so like I was saying, SVM, the entire ideology is to find the classifier which has the maximum margin. So there is some terminology which you need to understand. First is the margin, which I already described. Then there are something called as support vectors. So the term like support vector machine is the full form of SVM. That is because it comes from the support vectors. Support vectors are those samples which is the first encounter for this particular classifier for that particular class. So you can say this is the closest point to this particular classifier from that particular entire class. Similarly, from all the red classes, the closest point to the classifier is this red color point. So hence these two particular data points are called as support vectors. And optimal hyperplane is nothing but it will always lie in between the margin. So if margin is say 10 units, optimal hyperplane will lie somewhere at 5 units. So optimal hyperplane is always the midway hyperplane between the two support vector hyperplanes. Okay. So let's go at the algorithm. Very simple algorithm. You just 3 different steps. Your main entire calculations happen at this maximizing the margin. We'll discuss that in next slides. But these are the 3 different steps in the algorithm. First is you need to identify the support vectors. And once you identify the support vectors, you need to find a classifier that will maximize the margin with respect to these support vectors. And then you finalize the decision boundary, which is basically the midway between these margins or the support vector planes. Simple algorithm. So you can always take an analogy of a cooking show, let's say. So in a cooking show, there are 2 teams. On the right side, you have team A. On the left side, you have team B. And if you want the judges to pass through the midway, you need to make sure that the judges are passing to the exact center. Otherwise, they'll get more biased towards one or team or the other if that particular pathway is closer to one team or the other. So that is why this is a simple analogy. SVM can be thought of as creating a midway between a competition show. Okay. So these are some again simple examples about how you can use the SVM algorithm. So I will skip this because there is a lot more content to cover, but you can always look at this simple example, which is basically similar to what the cooking show concept is. Okay, now let's go a little bit in detail on how you will actually calculate this margin and how will you finalize the decision boundary. So before that, a little bit of linear algebra, a little bit of coordinate geometry and linear algebra is needed. So let's say this dotted 1 is hyperplane 1, H1, and this dotted line, second dotted line is hyperplane 2. Okay, so now we also say that everything that is beyond this point, this is the equation of the hyperplane 1, and this is the equation of the hyperplane 2. I hope you all are familiar with the hyperplane equations. If not, maybe I'll quickly define it. Everyone is familiar with the line equation, right? A line equation is y is equals to mx plus c. So a hyperplane is nothing but a line in a higher dimension. So instead of 1m and 1x, you will have a vector m. In here we are writing it as w. So this is a w vector into an x vector plus some bias c, and this value y is basically your 1 or minus 1 over here. So it could either be 1 or minus 1. So here if you expand, because you have multiple features, right? So that will be a bunch of different across the different features f, wi, xi. I'll just write b over here. This is the offset from the origin. Okay. So if that is clear, so hyperplane is nothing but an extension of a simple line into multiple dimensions. So these are the 2 equations which we have, and we say that everything beyond this equation, so everything greater than this particular equation, right, wx minus b greater than equal to 1, will indicate that all of the points are y is equals to 1 class. Similarly, wx minus b minus 1 less than or equal to 0, or you can just come back and less than or equal to minus 1. These are all the points which are this side, and which means that they belong to class minus 1. So this is how you basically do the classification in SVM. Now once you have 2 hyperplanes, the distance between 2 hyperplanes is nothing but 2 divided by the magnitude of your weight vector. So I won't go through the derivation, but this is a standard derivation used in coordinate geometry. You can just look it up, how you can calculate the distance between the 2 hyperplanes. You can first calculate the distance of this hyperplane with respect to origin, calculate the distance of the hyperplane 1 with respect to origin, and then you can equate them both, and you'll get this distance 2 divided by the magnitude of your weight. So the margin now is this particular value. So Once you understood that point, I think everything else is similar. So this is your final optimization problem in SVM. So what is my optimization problem? I need to find, okay, previously what we wanted to say, max of the margin. This is what we wanted. What is my margin? My margin was 2 divided by magnitude of weights. Now max of something which is in the denominator, if you reverse it, it will become this particular value, minimum of that particular weight magnitude in the numerator. So it's a simple max min combination. So previously you wanted the maximum of margin. Now that particular value will become the minimum of this equation. So once you have this equation, there are certain conditions that has to be met. So this equation is a constrained equation we call in specific terms. So those conditions are these, where yi into w of xi plus b must be greater than or equal to 1. This basically is saying that all the positive classes are on the left side, all the negative classes are on the right side. Now this problem can be solved using convex optimization. So the derivation of this particular equation is a very lengthy derivation that itself takes 1 hour. So I will skip that, but for people who are interested, there is always the link I mentioned in the bottom of this slide. You can always look into that mathematics entirely behind this derivation. So this derivation involves 3 Lagrangian multipliers, convex optimization, and then there is KKT conditions. So a bunch of different mathematical details are needed to calculate this particular optimization. So once you identify the optimal W values, then there is nothing much to do. If you that will be the margin, and the optimal classifier is that W values into X minus B equal to 0. That is your final classifier. So let me just quickly pause before moving forward. Is this derivation up till now clear, or any doubts? Okay, so if this is clear, then let's move on to a more complicated version of SVM, which is called as kernel tricks. So why do we even need kernel tricks? Let me go a little bit behind the motivation. So in this particular plot, previously when we saw the plots, right, for this example, these were still linearly separable. So a particular straight classifier or a linear classifier can separate these two classes. This is great when the data is such. But what happens if your data is like this? Here there is no linear classifier that can separate these two, class 1 and class 2. So any guesses what can we do over here? Like, what does your intuition say that can be done in such situations? Any guesses? Like, imagine if something is not linear in a particular scenario like that. Sorry?
Curved line.
Yeah, but SVM doesn't give curved lines, right? We are talking only about hyperplanes in SVM. Hyperplanes are always linear.
Okay.
So you can't get curved lines in SVM. So for that, I think the trick is something called as projection into higher dimensions. So let me go through that. So imagine you have the same plot in 2D. When you project this into 3D, then these data points which were not linearly separable in the lower dimensions become separable in higher dimensions. So this is a very important observation that actually helped SVM to solve more realistic problems, because before that it was only solving simple linear cases which even logistic regression can solve. That is not a great thing, right? It was this observation where they saw that anything which is not linearly separable in lower dimensions, when you project them in higher dimensions, then they can be linearly separable. So once you get the higher dimensions, then you can apply the same SVM optimization technique to get your hyperplane that can separate these two in this higher dimension. But now the next question remains, how do we even project them? Because one thing is you can add an extra dimension to every data point and you can make them into higher dimension. But this is not computationally efficient. That is where they found out certain functions called as kernel functions. So these are very special functions which has certain special properties that is based on the similarity of the data points. Again, the derivation itself is very lengthy, but you can always look into the kernel function derivation in the same link which I showed you. So they talk about the kernel functions and all, what should the properties that should satisfy for a function to become a kernel function. So those kernel functions, how does it help? So it reduces the computational efficiency in projecting from these 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. So it's a more efficient way of projecting from lower to higher dimensions with the help of kernel functions. So now we have efficient functions to project, and once they're projected, they're linearly separable. So easily SVM can be used in a more complicated scenario. So this is what it looks like. So this particular non-linear case, it was projected into a higher space with the help of RBF kernel. RBF is full short form for radial basis function. So very good function. It is inspired from the Gaussian distribution. So with the help of that function, they were able to project it into a higher dimension. Then they applied SVM, and once they come back to the lower dimensions, this is the curve that is visible. So now previously SVM gave linear planes, hyperplanes. Now it can also give this non-linear hyperplanes. The margin is these dotted points. So very interesting observation and trick. And this actually made SVM one of the most popular algorithms from 1990s to 2010s. No other machine learning algorithm would be would beat SVM. In fact, any conference journal you used to go, your paper would get easily accepted if you're doing something on SVM or a version improvement on it. But now, obviously, with more higher and higher advancements in the field, deep learning networks kind of become like the SVM. Okay. So let's talk about what are the hyperparameters in SVM. Like I said, these hyperparameters are something which have to be fixed by a domain expert, and it's just not trainable parameters when you're doing your training of the algorithm. So in this case also, there are 3 different hyperparameters. Actually, there are more, but the important ones are these 3. First one is the C values. So what is the C values? Let's look at it. So C value, when it is low, it means that it can allow some of the points to be misclassified. So when you're considering the margin, you can be more lenient. So previously what we did, we had considered the closest point as a support vector. But when C is 1, we be more lenient. We can, okay, some points can come inside. It's okay even if you misclassify. We'll have more leniency. So you're more, you're not penalizing the error so much over here. Whereas if C is equals to 100, your margin is very small because you're very strict. Nothing should be misclassified. If something is misclassified, your penalty is very high. So this is what the hyperparameter controls. Again, there is no one correct value. You have to just try a bunch of different C values and identify which is helpful for your particular use case. So this is the hyperparameter C. Next, obviously the kernel function, which I said, based on different kernels, you get different types of decision boundaries. If your kernel is a simple linear kernel, which is standard SVM, right, then you get a straight or a linear hyperplane. If it is polynomial kernel, then you get something like a curved like this. This is based on the polynomial functions. And if you have RBF, you get even more curved. So RBFs are very strong hyperplanes, very strong classifiers. But again, always don't jump using RBF because they can overfit to your data. If you all remember, overfitting is when you are memorizing the data, right? We discussed in the first class. So RBF tend to overfit the data if your data is not very complex or very small. So make sure you choose the right kernel for your particular example. Okay, I think we are done with SVM. Now, there is another small part in SVM where you, like previously we said, SVM is applied to classification, but SVM can also be applied to regression. So before seeing that, let's understand what regression is first. Then only we'll understand how SVM can be applied to regression. So up till now, we saw classification. What was classification doing? The goal was to create a classifier that can discriminate or separate the classes. But in regression, the goal is different. The goal over here is to fit the particular data points. So this line, red color line, is my regression line, which is trying to explain all the data points that are given to me. You can understand regression in a more simpler way like this. So where is it applicable? Like for example, if someone wants to know a relationship between your study time and exam scores, right? You quickly collect some data and then you try to fit a pattern, and then and then you try to fit a line. And then based on this line, you can predict next time if I study for 20 hours, what will be my exam score? Or something less also. If I study for just 1 hour, what score can I expect? So such type of relationships can be learned with the help of linear regression. Of course, this is a very simple. Don't take that this is a correct representation of study time and exam hours, exam scores. Okay. So let's recap what are the algorithms we saw. We saw k nearest neighbors, logistic regression. So the logistic regression name can be a bit misleading over here. While it is regression, the name is there. It is a classification algorithm. So it has nothing to do with regression. So a lot of people who are entering this field confuse logistic regression to be a regression algorithm because the name has regression, but no, it is a classification algorithm. You can't do any regression on logistic regression. Then we studied about naive Bayes and decision trees. So even decision trees can do regression, which we saw yesterday. So instead of classes, we can always end up with a mean of a certain value or a bins or discretization of those ranges and all those things. We can do regression. Like even today, which we saw SVC, which is a version of SVM used for classification, it can also do regression. So let's first see some more details in regression, and then I'll explain how SVM can be used over there. Okay, so in regression, there are two types of variables, and not just regression, in standard statistics for that reason, there are two types of variables, independent variables and dependent variables. So for example, in the picture which you see, the independent variables is like amount of water and amount of fertilizer, whereas your dependent variable is height of the plant. So based on amount of water you give to the plant, your height of the plant can change. Similarly, based on the amount of fertilizer you give, the height changes. So we are seeing that the height is dependent on something like these variables. So that is why these are the dependent variables, these are the independent variables. In terminologies x1, x2, x3, previously which we saw, those are all features I called, right? Those are all independent variables. The dependent variable is your class final output y, or your class for that reason in classification. Okay, so this was linear regression. Now what does the equation itself looks like? This is what the equation looks like. So it's a simple linear dependencies between the independent and dependent variables. And so if you see y is equals to w0 plus w1 x1 plus w2 x2 so and so up to wn xn. Now this w0 is the intercept or bias, x1 x2 xn are the features, independent variables, y is your output or the predicted variable. Now the goal of linear regression is to learn these w values. You can apply your same gradient descent concept which we saw during logistic regression, right? You can apply the same concept because you have a predicted value. You can find out the error. I'll talk about what errors can be used. You can calculate the error of this predicted value with your ground truth value, and then you can calculate the gradient of those losses, and then update your weight values. So you can apply the same gradient descent algorithm to learn on these weights. That is one method, which is called as ordinary linear regression. There is also, okay, before that, this is, for example, what are we predicting during the prediction time? Like I said, if let's just say my test sample is in green color. So this green color, we look at the value where that green color is on corresponding to that particular red colored point. And then that particular point is my y value. So if my green, let's just say 7, okay, the 7 is my independent variable value. The corresponding dependent variable, we look on the y-axis. So that is my prediction that happens in linear regression. Okay, so now let's go a little bit in deep about how these errors can be calculated, or what are the errors that can happen when you're trying to fit the line, because of course not one line is possible, right? A bunch of different lines are possible. So you need to select which particular line is the best for you. So for that, error is nothing but the amount of deviation from the actual data point to the predicted data point. So for this particular example, right, your predicted data point is somewhere over here, 70, whereas the actual data point is somewhere over here, which is less than like 52 or 53. So this 70 minus 52 is your error. That is one way to calculate error, but this gap is what I'm trying to tell you. All these dotted lines which you see, right, this is the error. Now what metric to calculate, that is also different metrics are available. Let's see those. So these are bunch of different metrics that are available. Let's go one by one. On the top, this is a simple linear regression equation, or a straight line equation for that reason, y is equals to mx plus c. And whatever is the output, we represent it as y hat. The ground truth, we represent it as y. So Now the first error is the most simplest error, called as mean squared error. So this is a standard error where you calculate the difference between your ground truth value minus your predicted value whole square, and then you sum this over all the samples. So you take the average value of the summation of the ground truth minus the predicted value whole square. So this is one error. Then there is another error called as just the mean error, where you just take the mean without any square. Then you also have another variation on the right side called the mean absolute error, where instead of just calculating the difference, you take the absolute value of the difference. And then there is the most popular one called the R squared, or R2 also people call it, or the other name is coefficient of determination. So I'll come to this in a second, but maybe I'll quickly open this for a question. Which one do you think overestimates your error, with mean squared error or mean error or mean absolute error? Which out of these three can overestimate your errors that is actually there in your particular model? Any guesses?
Mean absolute error.
No. I'm asking about overestimating, right? Because overestimating means it is more than what it actually is. So when you're squaring something, right, you're overestimating those values. So if, for example, my error was 1 unit, then now, sorry, one is not a good example. If my error was 2 units, when I take the square of it, it will become 4 units, which is much more than my actual estimate. But here in absolute value, it will still be just 2 units. So overestimating usually happens when you do mean squared error. But again, it is not necessary that it is a bad metric. It is a very standard metric. It just depends on what application you want to. Sometimes you want to show higher estimates of errors so that your model gets more penalized. But sometimes you don't want that because it can just never make your model learn. It depends on your data set and your particular task. So these are the most common ones. Apart from this, there is a metric called as R2 metric. So R square metric. So let's look at it, what it does. Let's look at first just the numerator. In the numerator, it says yi minus yi hat whole square. Now, if I take just this numerator and divide it by n, isn't this something like the variance? Variance equation is this, right? Variance equation is yi minus your mean value, but instead of mean, let's just keep, instead of y hat as the mean, yi minus the mean value whole square divided by n. That is your variance, right? So basically here what we are saying is this, instead of the mean, you are having some prediction. So how good is this prediction and how close it is in explaining your data points, or how close it is? Because if this was a very good prediction, then the value will be 0. And then it means that this is able to explain a lot of variance in your data set which you are given. So that divided by your denominator yi minus yi bar is the mean of your all the blue points. This is again square. That square is missing over here. So make sure there is a square in the denominator also. So yi minus yi bar whole square. So it is basically the amount of explained variance or error divided by the total variance of error that is there in this model. So 1 minus of this particular term is your R2 R square metric. So best value for R squared is 1. When this error itself is 0, then it is 1. It means that your line is perfectly explaining all the variance that is there in your data. Worst is 0, when it's not at all explaining, it's very bad. Sometimes it is even possible to go negative when the model is not at all even performing to the mean level. It's not even predicting the average value, because what is the least or the worst case scenario that you can do is just predict the average value of your data point all the time. Then it means that you're at least good to the average value. But if your model is not even doing that, then R2 can go to negative. So you can look over this equation once again in your own time and compare it with the variance and how it is the explained variance divided by the total variance and all. But that is what the entire concept of R2 metric is. Any question in this, any of these errors? Any doubts or anything? Okay, great. So now let's move on. So this is a bit more visualization about your R squared metric itself. So the blue color line is your mean value of your all the data points. The red color line is your predicted line or your fitted line. This orange points are the total variance, the orange points, whereas these blue points are the explained variance. So the blue points are the numerator values, this light blue points, whereas your orange points are the denominator values. Okay. So now let's look at a limitation of linear regression. So obviously not every data, like in the case of your classification, right? Not everything is linearly separable, and not only linear classifiers are not the only classifiers that are possible. Same thing with even your regression. If you just use linear regression in real world data, it will not work, because some most of the times the data you get is non-linear, something like this. So any guesses what is the best curve for this particular type of data? It's very simple. Just by observation, what do you think should be a good curve or a fit for this particular type of data? Just look at how the data is patterned, right? The pattern of the data. What type of curve you think will fit the data perfectly?
Parabola.
Yeah, exactly. So a very good curve will be something of the second order, which will give you something like a parabola. But obviously in linear regression, you can't get non-linear curves. And that's why here you have very high errors. It'll, whatever you change, how much ever you try to optimize, you'll always get very high errors over here. So in that case, the best problem is this quadratic regression curve, which can very nicely fit this entire data. So this is another type of non-linear curves. This is adjusted exponential regression model. Then there is also logarithmic regression model. So you take any of your standard functions, right? You can always use those to fit your data if it's of that particular type. Now let's come to the support vector regression itself. So previously what we saw in support vector classification, we wanted to maximize the margin between the two support vectors. Support vector regression, it's kind of like the inverse. So here you have something called the epsilon tube. So you create a tube of width epsilon, and inside this tube, right, whatever points are there, you are not going to count them as wrong or right. So even if they're wrongly classified, you ignore them. You only calculate error for the points which are outside this particular tube. So here now what is the goal? You want to make this tube in such a way that most of the points are inside this epsilon tube, and at the same time able to give good metrics. So whenever the point is outside this tube, you get a error. These are called slack variables. Like here we call them support vectors. Here we call them slack variables. So the goal is to minimize the number of slack variables, and at the same time in your given epsilon you want a very good higher number of r squared value. So this is what support vector regression does, which is slightly inverted to what support vector machine for classification is. So similarly, you can use the same kernel tricks what you used, right? When your data is non-linear, you can do the same thing over here. So let's look at the left side first. If you use a simple linear SVR, so this is your margin, and these are the margin boundaries. This is that epsilon tube, and all the support vectors are outside these tube. What are all these support or slack variables? These are all the slack variables. So all the points on the yellow which you see, these are all these slack variables which you have to reduce the error, because those are not lying inside the margin. So obviously clearly this is not a very good curve, because there's a lot of errors still there when you're just using a simple linear SVR. Now if you use a non-linear SVR, this is again a radial basis kernel, then you see that immediately the curve becomes very non-linear, and it is able to accommodate a lot of points inside this tube. Only very few points are now support vectors or slack variables. So you have reduced the error by a lot. So this is how you use support vector machines for regression. Okay. So let me pause quickly for a second over here. Any doubts till now? Because now we are moving into unsupervised learning. Any doubts in any of the algorithms that we discussed in supervised learning? Okay, great. So if there are no doubts, now let's move into this unsupervised learning. So if you remember in the very first session, we talked about there are two popular settings, supervised learning and unsupervised. The difference was in supervised learning, every input sample came with a label, like this particular picture of an animal came with its label duck, duck, not a duck, not a duck. And then you have any algorithm, your standard SVM naive based decision tree. That algorithm learns to map this input to this particular type of output. And then whenever a new sample comes in, it uses that predictive model to give a class to this particular test sample, whether it's a duck or not a duck. In unsupervised learning, it's the sorry the techniques are different because there is no labels associated with the input samples. So what do you do? One of the most simplest and intuitive way is to cluster them or group them based on their similarities. So if I give this bunch of different images to you, and if I ask you to group it, you obviously group all the ducks together based on certain features, like they have a beak, they have 2 feet, then they have a certain body structure. All these, based on these, you create or you cluster them into one cluster. Similarly, rabbits and the other animals are not at all similar, so they have their own clusters. So in this way, based on some similarity of their features, you group similar things into one cluster. This is the entire idea. So let's look at it in a more social setting. So if you're going into some networking session, right? So you have a bunch of different tables. So usually all these networking sessions, they come with a variety of people coming inside them. And each of these table have a bunch of different people. Some people are all working in business side. Some people are all working as, academicians. Some are just working as models. So, each table has their own similar vibe. That's why people only usually sit at one of the tables, because that is where they are most familiar with to that particular conversation. So naturally, people use this clustering algorithm in their day-to-day lives in most of the things, even without realizing that you're forming these clusters or groups. So in a more data centric point of view, this is how that if you have a data like this, which is a customer segmentation based on amount of annual spending and the frequency of visits. So these are the 3 different clusters that are formed. Each cluster will have its center. So you can calculate the center either by calculating the mean of the values, or based on the centroid of these data points. You can use different methods for that. Each method will give you a different answer. So each of these diamond looking blue things are the cluster centers for that particular clusters. So in this case, we have 3 clusters and 3 cluster centers. So like I said, in real world, we use clustering actually a lot. So where do we use? Netflix recommends, right? Like, how does Netflix and the Spotify apps recommends you shows or music? Clustering is actually a technique that they use. No, obviously not just clustering. They use much more refined techniques combined a little bit with the feedback and reinforcement learning and all those things. But bottom line is they try to group things which are similar in nature. That is why whenever you watch something like a crime show, immediately you will get a bunch of next suggestions related to crime. Similarly, if you listen to some happy music, then immediately you get songs which are very similar in genre to that particular music. That is one real world example. Second is, doctors actually use clustering by grouping patients with similar symptoms and conditions. So especially during the COVID time, right? People were trying to group especially when they're trying to create the COVID vaccine. They were trying to group people of certain similarities or symptoms and conditions, and then they were trying testing out different vaccines and how it is affecting that particular group and all. Then also scientists use clustering to analyze their experimental data to identify new species, genes, and other types. Even when they're discovering or understanding the structure of galaxies, right? They use this type of clustering. So clustering doesn't necessarily confine to unsupervised learning. Clustering just happens in any of your day-to-day activity, most of the day-to-day activity. Sorry. So again, here is a simple example in a grocery chain store, right? Let's say if you have to sort or place all the items, group them by their similarity. Like for example, you want to group all the breads near the jams section or the butter section, because people who are likely to buy jam or butter will likely buy bread, right? So those type of ideas which people use in most of these like supermarkets you go, all of them again use some type of clustering. They don't use the algorithm, but inherently human minds are made to do that. So I won't go step by step over here. We will discuss the algorithm itself, and then we can go. Okay, so maybe I'll just quickly go here because this describes a little bit of the algorithm. So first thing is, before when you're asked to group similar things, so you can use any algorithm, clustering algorithm. The most popular clustering algorithm is your k-means algorithm. So that is what we will discuss in this and the coming slides. So what are the different steps in k-means algorithm? The number one is, you need to know how many groups or clusters you want. So that is the k value over here in k-means. K defines the number of clusters that you are going to form at the end. The second step is, obviously initially you just randomly select k centers and you call them as centroids. That is the first second step. Third is, now you start grouping all the things which are closer to this center. Obviously initially, in initial iterations this will be wrong, but that's where we keep on updating the centers. But in the second step, when you randomly pick a center, in the third step you find out all the points that are closer to each of these centers, and then you create now a new center with these new points which are forming the cluster one. And next, in 5 and 6, you keep on repeating this process of creating a new center, again grouping all the similar things which are closer to the center, and then updating the center by adjusting to this new points, and then you keep on doing until you find a convergence. So maybe let's look at it in visualization purposes with the help of this graph plot. So let's just say this is the initial setup with random centroids. So your red color points are random centroids. So you have 4 centroids, k is 4 over here. So randomly you pick these 4. Now what you do is, you calculate for this particular center what are all the closest points. So now these are all the closest points to this particular center. So this all will initially become cluster 1. For cluster 2, there are no closer points, so no points are there. For cluster 3, here these are all closer points. For cluster 4, these smaller things are closer points. And now with this new clusters which you form, you again update the mean. So you calculate, update the centers. What I mean is that all these cluster points, you calculate a new mean, and that will become the new cluster center for cluster 1. Similarly for cluster 2 and cluster 3 and cluster 4. Then again you repeat the process of calculating whichever points are closer and create new clusters. Finally, you will end up with a graph, with a plot like this, where each particular cluster center is corresponding to one particular cluster which are far away from each other. So I hope this iterative process is clear. Maybe let's look at the algorithm if that helps. So we start off with random at point number 2. We start off with randomly selected input cluster centers, which we label at mu1 to mu k. Then for each point, that is I is equals to 1 to n, we calculate which of the points are closer to which cluster. So this gamma is like a flag. This gamma ij is like a flag which keeps track of which point is closer to which cluster. So once you iterate over all the data points, now after that you update the centers, cluster centers. That is done by just taking the mean of these new points which are there in this new cluster. Now the mu j's will all get updated, and then you repeat this entire process until you see a convergence. So maybe a question, what do I mean by convergence? What is convergence? When does it happen? Based on this algorithm which you see, what do you think convergence mean over here? Any guesses?
Until error minimum.
Close. It's not error. It's basically until these centers are not getting shifted anymore. So we keep on updating the centers also, right? But after a certain point, if the center values are pretty much close by, very close by, then you, how much ever you update, the centers will always remain the same. So that is called as convergence in this particular scenario. In usually in convergence in other set algorithms like your classification, over there your statement will be exactly true, where error keeps on getting minimum and minimum. That will be a convergence. But in unsupervised, it's a bit different. This is actually one other reason why metrics for unsupervised learning is not very definitive. So like for classification, you have accuracy, precision, recall. For regression, you have R2 square and a bunch of different metrics. For unsupervised learning, like k-means itself, there are metrics which are available, but those are again not very clear as to what are these the final metrics, or you can always come up with new metrics for your own case. So there's nothing final for k-means type of clustering algorithms. Okay, so this was unsupervised learning. So now let's slightly shift more from unsupervised learning to ensemble methods. So ensemble methods, like the name suggests, it means more than one method. So up till now, whatever algorithms we saw, right? We started off with k nearest neighbors. Then we started off with logistic, naive based, decision trees, SVC and SVR, then k means. These are the six algorithms which we saw. All of them are single machine learning models. There is no combination of machine learning models or anything happening over here. It's just a single one machine learning model. So what does a combination of machine learning models look like? That is what ensemble methods is. But before that, let's look at what are the challenges that single machine learning models can face. So these are popular challenges that the single machine learning models can face. So we want to ideally be in this scenario where there is low bias and low variance. So imagine this is your dart board. So you all played this dart game, right, where you keep on throwing small arrows onto the board and you expect to land in this red circle. That is where you get the highest points. So imagine you have this dart board. So you would ideally want to pick a model that would land in this red point. And what is the red point? It is low bias and low variance. Means the model is giving very good test and training accuracy. But you usually sometimes also end up in these other scenarios where there's a lot of variance, but the bias is still low. You're still around this red point, but once in a while you're coming closer to the red point. But a lot of times you're going around the red point. This is high variance, low bias. Now, if you come to the scenario of high bias and low variance, where you're nowhere closer to the actual optimum point, you're somewhere on the top, but you're consistent at least on being wrong or far away from that point. You're not like all over the place. You're still closer in your all your trials, but you're still far away from your optimal point. Then there is other type of situation where you can end up where you're neither closer to the point nor you're even closer to every trial of what you're trying. This is a very bad scenario to be in, high variance and high bias. So let's see how this looks in terms of your algorithms. So this is again correlates to the three concepts which I discussed on the very first day, the underfitting, overfitting, and the optimal or just right type of a model. So we said that you can look at the error curves. Let's look at the error curves now that you all know what training and validation errors are. So underfitting happens when both your training and validation error is high. So it means that the model, it's not even doing good on training. So for example, if you take in regression setting, you have a non-linear data and you're using a linear regressor, right? This is a very bad situation to be in because you'll never do good even on the training data set because it is not even going to fit this non-linear curve. So this is a case of underfitting in regression. Similarly, in classification, if you look at a scenario like this, where a lot of classes are being misclassified by this particular linear classifier, it is not a good classifier at all because it's again a simple linear classifier, whereas the data requires non-linear. So again, this is a scenario of underfitting in classification. Now let's go to overfitting. Overfitting is, like I said, when you have very low training error, but very high validation error. Remember, I'm saying validation, not test. Test should only be done once. Always make sure you don't remember this because I've seen a lot of people confusing this. Test should be done only once. It's the validation which can be done a lot of times to identify which particular hyperparameter or whether your model is overfitting or not. And that's how you plot these curves. But test should be done only once. Very important to remember. And that is the final value which you report either in your product or your paper. Okay. So overfitting is a scenario when your training error is very less, but your validation error is very high. So what does a scenario looks like for regression? It means that you are having a highly non-linear curve, which is kind of mimicking that entire training data point. It's like even if the data is going up and down, it's just the classifier is just going up and down, trying to match all the data points. It's like, if you take a pencil and join these dots, right? Some classifier like that is being created in regression. That is a very bad scenario because it will never generalize to test examples because this is all training points, right? If you get a test point which is like here, your model doesn't know what to do because it is just memorizing the data points. It is not learning the pattern of the underlying data. Similarly, for classification, if you end up with a curve like this, where you're trying to form a classifier which is classifying every data point which might be a noise point also. Maybe this blue color point which is closer to reds, it is noisily labeled as blue, but maybe it is actually a red point. That could be very likely true in real world scenarios. But since your model is overfitting, it won't learn that pattern and it will think that this is the best classifier. And when a test example comes, it will very badly fail. Your ideal situation is where you want to be in middle, where your training error is low, at the same time your validation error is low. Both of the errors are low. That is the ideal situation, which you can see, right? This parabolic curve is good for regression, and similarly this non-linear classifier is good for classification. Even though some points are misclassified, it is still fine. Okay, any doubt in this? Because very important concept if people are going for interviews and all. I think I've faced so many interviews where people instantly ask what is the difference between overfitting, underfitting, and then they keep on going into how is it connected to variance and bias and everything. So I hope people are able to connect the variance and bias with underfitting and overfitting. So maybe I'll put a question. I think it's already written over here. So in underfitting, you have high bias, whereas in your overfitting, you have high variance. So please remember that scenarios where which is high bias and which is high variance. Do you want me to explain how those are related to overfitting and underfitting, or is that clear? If anyone wants me to, just you can unmute and ask me. Okay, great. If that is clear, let's move on. So another problem with single machine learning model is the scalability and flexibility. Like you all know, you real world data is very adaptive in nature, right? Because most of the times the data which you keep on getting will be something which you've never seen during training time. So at that point, your model is not very flexible to adapt to this new data. At the same time, if it's a single model and if you want to scale it to a lot and lot of computers or lot of data which has billions and billions of data points, you can't really do that well with a single machine learning model. That is again another problem with them. The final problem is the diversity perspective. So if you remember, you are not seeing the entire data set that is available for your particular task. Like I said, you can't collect all the images of cats and dogs and give it to a machine learning model. It is never possible. You only see a part of this particular universal set. So when you look at that particular part, your single machine learning model will only look at a pattern for that particular part. Like for example, this is a very popular school of thought where if you have three people and you blindfold them and you show them three different parts of an elephant, each of them gave their own perspective. The first person touched the snake and thought it touched the trunk and thought it's a snake. The second person touched the body of the elephant and thought it's a wall. The third person touched the tail of the elephant and thought it's a rope. Similarly, your single machine learning model actually behaves like this because you're looking only at a small part of the data. It will think this is the pattern which will exist in any type of unknown scenario. But that is not the true, because like the elephant has different parts, even the data has different diversity components to it. So that is one major problem to single machine learning models. How to overcome? Ensemble methods is the solution. So ensemble methods, you can think of it like a brainstorming session where people come from different backgrounds come to discuss a solution. So here people are from a background of someone who's a doctor, someone who's an engineer, someone who's an entrepreneur, someone who's a philosopher, artist, everything. So bunch of different people come together and come to a decision. That is what an ensemble method looks like. Now let's look at the algorithm itself. So you first gather all the methods you want to use. Will be the bunch of different methods which you saw previously, right? The 6 different algorithms. It can either be a combination of them, or in one particular algorithm, like decision trees. You can have decision tree with the depth 1 as one algorithm, decision tree with the depth 10 as another algorithm. So similarly, you can combine a bunch of different those algorithms and call them as an ensemble cast. Then you train all of these individual algorithms on the data set, and then you combine the strengths, basically predictions. You combine all the predictions made by each of the algorithm. In the decision, you take two options: either you average them out, average all the predictions, or you take a vote, majority voting, which like if one particular class is highly voted by most of the algorithms, you select that as the final output, and then you keep on repeating this entire process. So this is a generic algorithm. Let's look at it in a more data set perspective. So it looks something like this. So you have your entire data set. You pick subset 1, subset 2, subset k, like that from this data set. You have k different models. Each of this model will look at a subset, and then during the prediction time, each of them will give its own predictions. At this point, you can either take a voting or you can take an averaging, and that will be your final prediction. So there are two different types of ensemble methods called as bagging and boosting. Very important. Okay, so one other important thing which I forgot to tell. The current state of the art of machine learning are either a boosting algorithm or a bagging algorithm. It is not a single machine learning model. So most of these companies which use, if they're using machine learning algorithms, which most of them still use, they use either a bagging algorithm. If you remember, I said random forest is a very popular algorithm. That is a bagging algorithm. And then there is boosting algorithms, which popular ones like ADA boost, XG boost. So there are a bunch of different variations, but these are the state of the art machine learning models. So we'll go over them one by one. Very simple. If you understood how previous methods are working, then these methods are simple to understand. So let's first look at bagging. So in bagging, you have your original data set, and then you do something called as bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is nothing but you're sampling with replacement. So I am assuming everyone is familiar with sampling with replacement. If not, just think of it like you're picking a subset of it, but those samples can again be picked in another subset. It's not like a mutually exclusive subsets. There can be some common data points in 2 or 3 subsets. So you do bootstrapping where you sample with replacement. Depending on your number of classifiers, you do that sampling with replacement, and then you train all these classifiers on these different versions of the data set, and then you combine all these classifiers. That is your bagging. So bagging name comes from bootstrapping and aggregating. So they combine these two names and they call it bagging. Okay, so let's maybe look at a very simple example. You want to predict the likelihood that a borrower will default on a loan based on the credit scoring. So again, you take multiple models that are trained on different subsets of the data set, and then each model in the ensemble will make an independent prediction about the risk of giving a loan. Then you average out the predictions and you get your final outcome. Now let's look at boosting. Boosting is a slightly different version. So in boosting, what you do is you take your original data, you take entire original data, then you give it to a classifier. Obviously, this is a very simple, small classifier. It will do mistakes also. So one, you'll identify all the samples which it did correctly, and you'll also identify all the samples which it did not do correctly. And the samples for which it did not do correctly, you increase the weightage of these samples. So now in the next iteration, the original data was not weighted, but now you have a weighted data. So now you force your model to do correctly on this examples which were previously done wrong. So in this process, you keep on continuing this entire iterative process, and then you'll finally end up with a classifier which can predict almost all of the samples with very good accuracy or without any error. So I hope this is clear. Very simple boosting algorithm. So a bunch of different variations on this, like how to weight the algorithms, or a bunch of how to select which are right, which are wrong. These are all the variations of ADA boost, XG boost, and bunch of different things. So any doubt in boosting and bagging, the methodologies, if it's clear, then we can move into their differences and all. Okay, great. So let's move on. Again, over here also, it's a very simple example. Maybe I won't explain it in the interest of time. You can also look into this example. It's a very simple facial recognition task is being done with ADA boost. How it can be done? You use the same concept. Original data set, identify the misclassified, increase the weight of the misclassified, and send it to the next iteration. So these are the differences between bagging and boosting. In bagging, you have first bootstrapping and then aggregation. In boosting, it's a sequential. So it's a parallel process. This is a sequential process. So these are the differences between bagging and boosting. So in bagging, you reduce variance. In boosting, you reduce bias. Maybe a question for the audience. How does bagging reduce variance and how does boosting reduce bias? You looked at the methodologies, right? Why do you think bagging reduce variance and why do you think boosting reduce bias? Okay, maybe I think it's too early. I won't tell you the answer. Think about it, because if you correctly understood the methods, then you will understand the answer. So I won't give you the answer for now. Think about it, and maybe we can discuss it tomorrow. Why bagging reduces variance and why boosting reduces bias. Okay. Again, in these cases, the base learners need to be homogeneous. So in these cases, you can't use, typically people don't use a variety of these logistic regression, SVM, all of these combined, they don't use in bagging because it's not really recommended. All of them have their own complexities of training and all. It works well if it's a homogeneous data, a homogeneous classifier. Like all of them are a variation of SVM, all of them are a variation of decision trees, all of them are a variation of some other algorithm. So that will be the best scenario. And like I said, bagging is a parallel process, whereas boosting is a sequential process. Usually the aggregation strategy in bagging is max voting or averaging. In boosting, it is weighted averaging. Okay, now let's come to simple random forest. I think if you understood bagging, random forest is also very simple to understand. So like I said, you have the original data set and you then pick a bunch of these samples in bagging, give it to a bunch of different trees. So here the tree 1 will be like a different depth or a different variation than tree 2 and tree n. And during prediction time, you send an instance, test instance to all of these trees. All of these trees predict some class A, class B, class C. Sorry, both of them predict class A, and the nth one predicts class B. After majority voting, your final class is A. This is it. Random forest is nothing but a combination of different decision trees. In fact, the name random forest also comes because it is a combination of multiple trees, and random because when you're bootstrapping, your bootstrapping is done randomly, right? So you're picking a random sample, so that's why it's called as random forest. So very simple name. So again, random forest, like I said, very popular algorithm. It is used for biomedical research, for disease diagnosis and biomarker discovery. So a simple example over here, you train your random forest first on different portions of your data set. Each decision tree is trained on a random subset. Like I said, that is how the bagging works. And then during the disease prediction time, you use this trained random forest to predict the disease or the stage of the disease that is present in a new patient data, so that you can detect early diagnosis. Similarly, for biomarker, you analyze the feature importance of all these features which are there in the decision trees generated by the random forest to identify which are the potential genes that can cause more diseases or associated more with the diseases. And then you validate the predictions and biomarkers. That is your standard evaluation process. Okay, so these are all the theory part I wanted to discuss. Is there any doubts? If not, I'll move on to the code part of these three algorithms. Okay, great. Let's move to the code then. So as usual, most of the things are still very similar over here today also. I want you to show something called as a pipeline, which is a slightly different concept. But again, most of the other parts remain the same. So that is one, like I said, one good thing about machine learning or scikit learners. You understand the code for one algorithm, you can write code for any algorithm. Coding is never a problem. It's always about how you use which model for what data set for what task. Okay, that being said, let's look at the code. First, always important, import your statements, whatever you're going to use. So all of them are standard. Pandas, we talked about, train test split, scalar, we'll talk about today, what is scalar, and imputer. These two things are new. Then SVC, yesterday we saw. Then SVC we didn't see yesterday. SVC is like Gaussian naive Bayes and decision trees, which we can import any algorithm. And then we have accuracy score. And then there is something called as make pipeline. I will tell you what that make pipeline helps you with. Okay, today we are discussing a data set called as the heart disease data set. So basically, again, it's a medical data set. I think it was combined by UCI. I'm not sure. Okay, that data set basically contains a bunch of features, and your prediction is whether the particular person has a heart disease or not. There are different categories of heart diseases basically. So if that particular person has that particular type of heart disease or not. So as usual, you read your data set with the help of pandas.read CSV. And here you convert first your categorical variables into numbers. So what do I mean by that is, sometimes in your columns you have like yes or no, right? While we know that these are discrete variables, yes is different from no, but for a machine, text doesn't really mean anything. So it's always important that when you have categories in your columns, convert each of these categories into some random number. So yes can become 1, no can become 0. So just like that, you need to convert all of these categorical variables which are in the form of text into variables. That is what this get dummies do. Very easy. Now, you don't have to worry about what to write also. Just call this get dummies. It will convert all your categorical variables into that indicator or dummy variables. After that, you obviously you take that last column, target column, and then you store it in your label variable y, and remaining all are your input features which you store it in x. Then you do your train test split. Here you have your test data set size which is 0. 0.2 and your random state size which is 40, random state which is 42 number. I hope you all remember why random state is important. Never forget to put the value correctly, or don't leave it for default basically. Okay, now we will talk a little bit about the imputer. What does imputer do is, sometimes when you collected a data, like numerical data, most of the times, even for categorical data, there will be some missing values in a column. Now, one option is you just drop that entire row because one particular column value is missing. But this could lead into a loss of data, right? Because just because, like, let's just say I have 65 columns and there are minimal rows, there are only 200 rows. And in these entire 65 columns, 64 columns have value. Just that one column doesn't have value. So it doesn't make sense to drop this entire row because one column doesn't have value. In those cases, these imputers help you. Imputers is basically how do you fill in that missing value. So usually there are a bunch of strategies, like if it's a numerical, right? So you look at the entire column for all the rows, and then you calculate the mean of the values, and then you put in that missing place that mean of the value, which is a very good imputation strategy. Sometimes people take median also, and a different bunch of different strategies are available. Look into the simple imputer class. Then scaling. Like scaling is very important, because if two different features are on different scales, like one is between 0 to 10, another is between 1000 to 10,000, then your model takes a lot of time to converge, or even sometimes it doesn't even converge. So to avoid all these problems, it is always recommended and suggested to first scale your data into common scales. That is where the standard scaler comes in. Okay. Now here in SVC, which is your type of SVM, super vector classification classifier, you mention what type of kernel you want to use. Like I've written, experiment different types of kernels, which is a very good practice for you. Try out different types of kernels and see how your values change, how the actual algorithm works and everything. Here I kept a very simple linear classifier. And now you call the instance of your algorithm into SVM model. Now this is where make pipeline comes in. So either you apply this standard scaler and imputer on your own onto the entire data set, which you can do, but it is taking more time. The best solution is you call something called as make pipeline. Like the name suggests, it makes a pipeline. You give it all the pre-processing steps that has to be done. You tell it first to do the impute the values, like missing values. Then you do all the scaling of the features, and then you apply the SVM model. So all these three things will be done by this make pipeline. So you don't even have to do pre-processing on your own. Just mention to this particular class what are all the pre-processing you want it to do, and it will quickly do it and give it to you. And then once that pipeline is created, you just do pipeline.fit. Yesterday we did model.fit, right? But now you do pipeline.fit on the training data set. Now again, when you're testing, you do pipeline.predict on the test set. You get your predictions. You just calculate the accuracy. So your accuracy is very bad, it's just 54%, which is an indication over here that the kernel is very bad. Linear kernel is not working on this data. Maybe the data requires something which is non-linear. Okay, so make pipeline, the only downside, at least I felt, is it takes a lot of time. So sometimes when you want to do a bunch of hyperparameter evaluation or tuning, right, make pipeline can take a lot of time, and it will take hours and hours. When you can do simply on your own, it will take probably lesser time. But again, this is a personal opinion. You can always try it out, and you can see it might work better for you in your case. Okay, now let's look at the hyperparameter tuning. Yeah. So same things again, the same data set. I skipped that. So it's the same data set. You again drop. You also convert your categorical variables, and then you split the data set. But now when you're doing hyperparameter tuning like yesterday, you need to have three parts. You have to have your train part, your validation part, and your test part. How did we do that? First, you take your entire data set, split it into two parts. One is temporary. Here in this case, it's called train val. Another is your test. This test is your final test set. This train val is further split into two more parts called your train and validation. Now here you create your pipeline. You want your imputer to be a mean strategical simple imputer. Then you also define your standard scalar. So here pipeline, here you're defining it on the processor, not on the model. So here it's a different type of a pipeline. Here the pipeline was defined for entire thing with the model, but like I said, sometimes it takes time. So here there's another version of pipeline which can only incorporate the pre-processing steps. So all the pre-processing things you can write in this big pipeline, and then you just do preprocessor.fit transform on your data sets, which will do first the insertion of missing values and then your scaling of the features. It will do that for your train and validation. Okay, maybe a quick question for you guys. So when I'm doing the scaling, right? Obviously, scaling happens either by Gaussian normalization, normalizing using that min-max type of a normalization or standard normalization type of techniques. But here, if you look at it, we are fit transform, means we're calculating that minimum and maximum value only corresponding to the train data set. But for the validation and test, we are using those same max min values which you got from train, but not calculating again the max and min values for validation and test set. Why do you think this is the case? Any guesses? So my question is, when you're, let's say, a simple type of a normalization, right? What is a simple type of normalization where you take every element, subtract it with the minimum, and you divide it with the range, which is max minus min. There is a very simple type of scaling. No, so when I'm doing the scaling on the training set, I am doing fit transform. What does it mean? It calculates the maximum value for each column and the minimum value for each column, and then scales every column accordingly. Now, when I'm doing the same transformation on validation and test set, I'm not calculating new max and min values. Instead, I'm using the max and min values of the train set itself. Why is that the case? Any guesses? Okay, so the reason for that is you don't want your data to get leaked. So if you remember, validation and test, these are something which are not observed during training time to the model, right? So when you are using a new max and min for validation and test, it means that you're seeing the data and you're making the data somehow biased to your particular pre-processing, which is wrong. Ideally, you should see only the trained data, and whatever max min you get, you should assume that this trained data is representative of entire universe, right? And then you use that same max and min for any sample that is coming in the future for validation and test. So that is the ideal way if you want to avoid data leak. Otherwise, if you do again fit transform, you'll get better scaling, but that is not correct way. You are just misleading your model into seeing your test data and validation data. So please never do that. A lot of first time people who are entering into this field make this error. They have a separate fit transform for both validation and test set, which will cause a problem. Okay, now once you've pre-processed your data set, let's do a hyperparameter tuning for the C value. If you remember, C value defines how much error is okay when you're doing your SVM classification. So a bunch of different C values are possible. We are taking in log space over here from -3 to 7. So like yesterday, we just write a for loop across different values. And for each value, you fit a model using this SVM model.fit. You fit the model on the trained data set. You calculate the validation accuracy and you store the values. And then after you finish, you find the best C which gave the highest validation accuracy. And then you fit that SVM with that particular best C on the entire train validation data set. And then you test it on your test data set. So this is what you'll see. So a bunch of different C values are there. And these are the validation accuracies. The best C value is when it is 1. 1 gave us 64%. And now when you finally use this 1 on the test set, you got 55%. which is again okay. So, but not best. This clearly indicative that 54 here you're getting and 55 here you're getting. It means that whatever hyperparameter tuning you're going to do, your model will really not get better accuracy, because the problem lies with your kernel over here. The kernel is the problem. It's not these C values or other hyperparameters. So this is all things which you'll understand by practice. So the more you train models, right, the more you'll understand quickly by looking at the values, what is the problem, which parameter is the problem, and how to avoid it. Okay. So now we'll do a simple regression data set, which is the California housing data set. So basically in this data set, based on a bunch of different features of a land, like the location, the what do you say, how what is the current legality issues on it, and a bunch of different other features are there. You have to predict what is the price of that particular house. So that data set is again available in this particular sklearns data set, and then you can get your x and y. You do all the standard things which you did till now. Is there a question? Okay, so you do all these standard things which you did till now. You first train, test, split. You apply your scaling functions, scale, fit, transform on your train. Don't do it on your test. That is very important. Then instead of SVC, you just call your SVR algorithm. So here again, for now I used kernel as linear. You can always change that. And then you fit. And then after you fit, you predict on the test scale, test value. And then you calculate your root mean square error. So this is your root mean square error, which is 0.76. So like I said, this is just one metric. There are a bunch of different metrics. You can use R2 also. So you can do again similar with different kernels. Here I did hyperparameter tuning across different kernels. So the same process remains the same. The for loop, everything remains the same. I just wanted you to show the values. So if you used RBF kernel, you're getting much lower validation RMS than compared to the linear. And here your RBF kernel gives you 0.586 compared to the linear, which was very high. Here you got linear 0.76. Here we are getting 0.586. So for root mean square error, it's error, right? So lower is better. For accuracy, it's the opposite. Higher is better. Okay. Any questions or any doubts in this entire code? I know I went a bit through fast because we've covered most of it yesterday, but again, please look into this code at your own time. Any questions you can ask me tomorrow also or day after until the classes happen. So let's look at the second one, regression and clustering. So here we first will look at a simple data set called diabetes data set. Again, based, so this is the diabetes data set based on a bunch of different attributes like age, sex, BMI, BP, and there are again some medical terms S1 to S6. These are some parameters. Based on all these values, you have to basically identify whether there is diabetes, or like how much is the diabetes that is there in this particular patient. Okay, so it's a quantitative measure of diabetes progression basically. So it's called it's not a single class or something. It's not like whether he has diabetes or not. It's basically a quantitative measure of how much diabetes progression has happened in a 1 year. That is your task over here. So we repeat all of the processes are same again. Load the data set, dataset.d, this particular word, right? DESCR. It's a short form for describe. It will basically give you this description what we could saw. It will describe entirely what is the data set. Okay. Then you split your data set into train and test split. And then you call your linear regression, which is again present in your sklearn. Then same process, you fit the data set on the test on the data train, X train and Y train. Then you predict on the X test. And now here you can also look at the coefficients. If you remember, coefficients are nothing but the weights, right? W0 to Wn, how many ever features are there. So here when you do regression regr.coef underscore, it gives all those coefficient values. You can also calculate your mean squared error and your R2 square. R2 square is the dot score. If you do, you get your R squared, sorry, not R2 squared, it's R squared value. So these are the different values you get. Mean squared error. So if you remember, I asked you a question, does mean square overestimate your error? Clearly it does, because mean square error is giving 2900 value. That is a very big value. Whereas R squared is just 0.45. So it's easier to evaluate in such ways if you have smaller numbers, because when it's very big numbers, you don't know whether it's either actually your model is wrong or you're okay with that much of error. It's a bit hard, but again depends on your use case. And these are different type of coefficients which are present for each of your input column. So for example, for age, this is the coefficient. For sex, this is the coefficient. For BMI, this is a coefficient, and so on. That is it. And you'll also have an extra coefficient for your bias. Now let's look at non-linear regression. Most of it remains the same. The only difference is you'll have to first convert your features into a polynomial degree. So that can be done using your make pipeline. In make pipeline, you convert your features into a polynomial features which have degree 2. So previously x1 will now become x1 square. X2 will become x2 square. A bunch of those things happen, and then you apply your simple linear regression on this transformed space. So you don't have to necessarily, polynomial regression doesn't necessarily have to mean that you'll have w1 square, w2 square. It means that your features are getting into they're transformed into a space which is of a non-linear in nature, like x1 square and x2 square. Then the other processes remain the same. Dot fit, dot predict, you calculate your mean squared and also your R2. So here again we use the decision tree. You don't have to worry again of if it's any different, it's the same, but a simple decision tree of depth 5. And here you can compare the values. So decision tree mean square is 0.71. For this it is 0.70. For similarly, this is on the housing board data set. For linear regression, the R2 values is 0.46. For decision rate is 0.47. Now let's look into clustering. So this is a very simple mall customers data set, which basically has just two features: annual income and the amount of spending. And then you again have k means, which is there in sklearn. You just have to mention what are the number of clusters, which is the k value. Here again random state is important. Why? Because if you remember, I said that the k centers are randomly initialized, right? So that is why this random state is very important. Then you fit the model. So there is no predict. Predict is fine. There is no what do you say? And there is no accuracy or anything over here because you don't have those labels. So here you're just fitting the model, and this is what the cluster centers look like. So these are the five different clusters that are formed, and the crosses are their corresponding centroids. Okay. Any questions in this clusters? Again, everything remains the same. It's just different algorithm changes. That's it. You have to make the changes over here in the name. Most of the pre-processing, post-processing steps remain the same for all the algorithms. But still, any questions? Anything that is unclear till now? Okay, then I'll quickly complete the last part also, which I wanted to discuss, and then we can end the session. So on some ensemble methods, he will look again at a very different data set, which is the wine quality data set. So here we number of classes. Basically, let's look at the features. Yeah, so we have a bunch of different features like acidity level, volatile acidity level, citric acid, sugar. These are all different attributes of a wine. And then you have 6 different classes of that wine. So based on these features, you have to classify into any of these 6 classes. So initially we can use a simple random forest classifier, which is existing in sklearn. So the process remains the same. I'm not going through all this because it's the same. First load them as data frame, then drop the values then store the target in the variable y, then train test split this x and y into training and testing. The only change comes at this particular ensemble classifier, which is random forest classifier. So here you mention how many estimators you want to use. This is the number of classifiers. So number of trees is what is mentioned over here. And the random set, because again here also there's a random process, the random splitting of the data set. So once that is done, you fit your data set, predict and accuracy score. So you're getting, I think, 66%, which is okay, not bad. But let's try and visualize the tree. So this is what a tree looks like in that random forest. This is the entire tree that looks like. So you can zoom in and look in the values. I'll share the code. You can also look at that, but you can also visualize how this entire tree looks like. It's very interesting. Now let's do some hyperparameter tuning on the number of estimators. So I had a bunch of different estimators, 50, 100, 200, 300. Process again remains the same. You have a for loop. For each estimator, you run the classifier and calculate the validation score. identify the best estimator, and then you test it on the test set. So these are the different values. The best estimator is with 300, best validation accuracy is with 300 estimators, and the final test accuracy is 0.68. Now let's look at boosting, ADA boost algorithm, like I said. And now let's get into a more realistic scenario. So CFAR10 is a very real, popular image classification data set. So even till now in research, CFAR10 is still being used in whenever you come up with a new what is a neural network algorithm, right? You test it on CFAR10 and report the values. So CFAR10 is still very relevant and popular. What does CFAR10 consist of? It consists of very common objects that you see. There are 10 classes. There is a bigger version of this data set also called CFAR 100. But the smaller version basically consists of 10 classes: aeroplane, automobile, bird, cat, deer, etc. etc. All common objects and living things. Again, process remains the same. Here I have included an extra function just to plot the images, but this has nothing to do with the training part. This is just to see how the images are plotted. It look like okay. It look basically like these images. You can see that those will get plot. So I have not called this function. It was taking a lot of time to train them. Okay, you first load the function using the data sets, but here you don't use sklearn data sets. There is something called as keras. Don't worry what this is for now. This is what we'll be discussing tomorrow. Not keras especially. We'll be discussing about neural networks and everything tomorrow. That is where I'll talk about PyTorch and TensorFlow tomorrow. Those are more popular algorithms for neural networks. Scikit-learn doesn't really is not really used for neural networks. I think there is some classes available, but people usually use PyTorch and TensorFlow for neural networks. So tomorrow we can discuss that, but just assume that you're getting your dataset CFAR10 from this particular library. And then you repeat the same process. You first reshape your image train into a flat vector. Why do I have to reshape into a flat vector? Because images come in a matrix form, and all these ADA boost algorithm and all, they really can't process data in a matrix form. They need data in a more vector form. So that is why you flatten this entire image into one big vector. Yeah. So that is why you flatten your train set and test set. Classes are anyways numbers, so that is not problem. Then you call your ADA boost classifier. Here you mention which type of classifier you want and how many such classifiers you want. So here I'm mentioning I want a decision tree classifier because it's a sequential, right? If you remember, and I want 200 such classifiers which have depth 1. And there are a bunch of different values, learning rate and all. Those are more algorithmic specific and it's a bit more advanced. But if you are interested, there you can always look into ADA boost algorithm and more latest variants of it. But the process still remains the same. You fit it, predict it, and get the accuracy, and you're getting 35%. So here the ADA boost is not doing great, but in general for many of the data sets, the ADA boost does very well. Here the data sets itself is very complicated. It's an image based data set and there are a lot of samples, and also the size of the image is very different. It's 32, right? Image in general has very different complexities, which we will discuss in the last day of our class. Okay, so yeah, this is what I wanted to discuss. Sorry if I moved a bit beyond the time, but any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer now. Please let me know. Any doubts or any questions related to any concept that we discussed? Okay, I think, ma'am, then if there are no questions, we can close the session then.
Okay, sir. So the